qualities best define today's data-driven global economy: volume and speed. S&P Global Market Intelligence is built to harness both. With billions of data points covering global market fundamentals to store-specific foot traffic, we transform raw data into actionable intelligence, enabling you to expand perspective, connect the seemingly unconnected, spot potential, then seize it. Teams of experts provide technology solutions that deliver timely, accurate data directly into critical workflows, driving greater efficiencies so business, government, and global markets can act quickly and make decisions with conviction. Whether supply chain insights, credit risk and ratings, private markets, economic indicators, or comprehensive ESG intelligence, the shift from quantity to quality is made at great velocity. We are here to accelerate. Are you? S&P Global Market Intelligence.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Pesh Patel, editor at Trade Finance Global, and welcome to this live stream. Sanctions and frosty trade relationships have been a consistent theme of international trade in recent years, but even more so after the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022. Since then, Western governments have attempted to curtail direct and indirect trade with Russia, both to impose economic punishment and curtail Russia's ability to produce military equipment. But as we all know, the world of international trade is often quite opaque, and whilst governments can introduce sanctions, their effectiveness is not guaranteed. So we need to dig deeper into how these sanctions are actually implemented and how effective they are, and how certain entities find a way to evade the sanctions and continue trading with Russia. To help us with this topic, I'm pleased to introduce Ravi Amin, trade compliance subject matter expert at S&P Global. Ravi, welcome to Trade Finance Talks TV.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Very pleased to be here.
Thank you, Ravi. So, quick introduction. Who are you, where are you from, and what do you do?
Yeah, so my name is Ravi. I'm based in London, working at S&P Global Market Intelligence. My role very much focuses on kind of providing expertise to everyone throughout the trade supply chain, essentially helping them to mitigate compliance risk associated with trade. So looking at your trade embargoes, your export controls, reviewing vessel compliance, and then looking for potential sanctions evasion techniques, and helping kind of customers work through that.
Thanks very much, Ravi. So let's just set the stage. Can you give a bit of a high-level overview of the sanctions imposed on Russia since the invasion of Ukraine and what those sanctions sought to actually accomplish?
Yeah, so it's been just over 2 years since the first round of sanctions were imposed on Russia. And the idea was to immediately try and stop Russia from doing the activities that they were doing in Ukraine. So the sanctions effectively covered kind of targeting Russian individuals, targeting Russian entities, kind of taking Russian banks outside of the US banking network, stopping vessels from entering Russian ports and exiting Russian ports, and then also looking to restrict the movement of goods kind of going in and coming out of Russia as well. So the idea would have been that they want to kind of restrict Russia's economy, stopping them from exporting goods and making money, and then stopping the import of goods into Russia to stop their kind of proliferation of their war efforts. So that would have been the kind of reason for doing the sanctions at the time, and obviously it's still current now.
Thank you. And can you perhaps talk about what some of those sanctions actually included? What products were included in the mix?
Yes. So it started off being quite specific to items that would have helped them in their military efforts. So covering lots of different types of electronics, going down to kind of a semiconductor, a chip that could be used kind of in missiles or things like that. And then it ended up being much broader items. So kind of large machinery, manufacturing equipment, and even further onto that, then it went into civilian items, looking at luxury goods, trying to restrict Russia as a whole from kind of doing any sort of activity like that.
Thank you very much. And have the sanctions actually been successful generally? What does Russia's overall trade profile look like now pre and post invasion?
That sanctions have been successful to a certain degree. So obviously you have most of the countries in the European Union, the US, the UK, obviously countries in Asia that have implemented these sanctions. And the data that we have seen shows that those countries obviously have stopped trading with Russia. So they've stopped importing goods from Russia in the last 2 years, and then they've also stopped exporting goods to Russia as well. But on the flip side of that, and then kind of answering your second question, Russia's still found a way to import and export goods. So what they've done is they've redirected their exports from previously the EU to countries in Asia. And then what they've done with the data that we found is they've imported goods from kind of neighbouring countries that don't have sanctions on Russia. So I'd say their overall trade profile is relatively consistent, kind of pre-invasion, post-invasion. What they've done is they've just used different countries to acquire those goods or to sell those goods.
So let's dive deep into that. What markets have actually increased their trade with Russia since those international sanctions have been levied? And has there been an effort by Western governments to curtail some of that trade, even through indirect or secondary means?
Yeah. So the data that we were looking at kind of shows, Russia's main trading partner is mainland China, and in the last 2 years that's continued to grow. The same kind of goes for India as well. So two major countries who have very strong ties to Russia have not sanctioned them and continue to do trade. In terms of countries increasing their trade with activity with Russia, I would say a lot of countries within the kind of Commonwealth independent states. So your Armenias, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, countries like that. And then also countries like Turkey that share relatively close proximity to Russia as well. Currently don't have any sanctions in place, have increased their trade activity with Russia. In terms of the US trying to kind of curtail those countries that don't have their own sanctions in place, there was an executive order in December of 2023, so towards the end of last year. It was by the order of the President, Executive Order 14114, and that essentially promised imposing secondary sanctions on foreign financial institutions known to be facilitating Russia's war efforts. So not only is the US looking at banks within the US or US banks outside of the US, they're now specifically looking at foreign financial institutions. So that would include banks in the countries that I've just mentioned. And then shortly after that release, US government officials did make some trips to kind of countries in Asia, doing like internal events where they said, look, this is for real, we are going to start to target your financial institutions if we find out that you're doing this. And they have actually implemented some sanctions on specific entities, since that time as well. So they are acting on what they promised.
Yeah, very interesting. And actually, I was looking at the map behind because I think that really that really brings it to life. And you've got some of the countries, Turkey, etc. Around here that are really facilitating some of that trade. It's really all of the bordering countries around Russia, right?
Yeah, I would say these countries here, so Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, the ones that kind of are in close proximity or there's no kind of sea, it's just land borders. We have found through the data that we've been looking at that they have been exporting or importing more goods from Russia in the last 2 years compared to pre-sanctions. I also didn't mention there are some countries in Africa where we also recorded an increased amount of trade. Countries like Kenya, I think Nigeria as well. Again, countries that have no sanctions in place on Russia, even though it's quite a large journey going to Russia, they've managed to find a way to do it.
Okay, let's talk about the actual types of goods and materials. What are they, and how are they getting into Russia through these intermediaries?
Yeah, so the focus is very much on goods that could be used in a military aspect. And there was a lot of research done by the US kind of finding items on the battlefield in Ukraine where they would then be able to go back and research what those items were, where they were coming from. I'd say mainly electronics and then manufacturing equipment for electronics as well. But also things as basic as ball bearings that could have some type of military aspect. And that would have been covered not only in the Executive Order 14114,
Yep.
but then also the Common High Priority List. That was a kind of joint regulatory guidance by the EU, the UK, the US and Japan, which covered all of those different types of goods that would have that military aspect as well.
Yeah, so I've got here some data from S&P Global Market Intelligence, and it's primarily finding that in the CIS countries, you've got equipment like discrete electronic components, wireless communications, satellite radio navigation, integrated integrated circuits and things like that. What's the significance of some of these materials? Could you perhaps explain the significance of those tier 1 through to 4B classifications, and maybe you could explain what those classifications actually mean, and how each of the categories of goods are actually being monitored for potential re-export to Russia?
Yeah, so we talked about the Common High Priority List. That was essentially your tier 1 to 4B.
Yeah.
It was essentially an amalgamation of 50 HS codes, which would have been grouping or a classification of different types of goods. It covered the electronics, like you said, your navigation, your radar, your surveillance equipment, but then also the manufacturing equipment to make those items as well, and then also manufacturing equipment for heavy machinery. So what we did is we looked at the guidance from the US. So in June of 2022, the US released guidance on transshipment risk hubs. So countries that they knew could be used to be a pass-through of basically US manufactured items going to Russia. So it was about 16 countries. There were countries in South America. South Africa was an example. The CIS countries that I mentioned, Turkey, India, and then also mainland China as well. And the idea was for us to look at whether those countries were importing those goods in your tier 1 to 4B from the US in 2021, so pre-invasion, and then looking at 2022 data and then 2023 data to see whether there was a change. And then looking to see whether those same countries were exporting those items to Russia, again, pre-invasion and then post-invasion. And yeah, the data was relatively conclusive. There was a large increase in those countries that were known to be transshipment risk hubs, importing goods from the US, and then almost directly re-exporting them to Russia. So it wasn't like they were importing them for their own use, because before 2022 they weren't importing those goods, and suddenly there was kind of a vast increase. And then the same goes for exporting to Russia. Before 2022 they weren't really exporting those goods to Russia, and then post 2022 we saw a large increase in the amount of trade of those goods to Russia.
Very interesting. I guess I mean, it'd be interesting for you to talk about the actual data analysis, because I guess it's not as easy as just collecting publicly available data to see some of those trends, right?
So we had to use the HS codes that were provided in the documentation. So the HS code would essentially group together certain goods under a 6-digit classifier. And then the idea would be that we would then collect the data from various countries, telling us whether they were importing and exporting the goods classified by that HS code. And then the idea is we would analyze it by value. So how much trade of that particular HS code is going from, say, the US to, for example, Kazakhstan.
Yep.
And then at the same time, is Kazakhstan exporting that HS code to Russia? And that was how we essentially analyzed the data. Essentially macro trade data coming directly from customs agencies, government authorities in those countries that are providing us the data directly.
And it's really interesting because if you look at some of the exports of certain goods in 2021, they reported a 0, and then there's a marked increase in 2022 and 2023. So let's talk about some of the mechanics of sanction busting. Some countries are exporting more US manufactured goods than they are currently importing. How does that actually work, and what are the implications of this?
Yeah, so I think the trend is exactly that. They were essentially importing it from the US and then directly exporting it.
Yeah.
But I think also what it shows is that they were potentially importing it from other countries as well within Europe. So countries like Germany that might be quite a large exporter of electronics, obviously post-invasion they would have stopped kind of all exports of those types of goods to Russia. But it's very likely, based on the data that we have, that those countries that we mentioned were obviously importing it from the US, but we're probably looking at other countries as well to kind of import those goods to then redirect it to Russia, essentially.
Brilliant. And actually, I want to see if we can get some more data, and actually figure 17 and 18, which is up on the screen now from the white paper, is probably a good example for this. But do you have any specific case studies to understand a bit more about this data, particularly around Executive Order 14114, to help us understand in a more tangible way?
Yeah, so with the Executive Order 14114, they didn't list HS codes, they listed specific goods.
Yep.
So, different types of propellant, different types of equipment. They mentioned ball bearing as a phrase, which is a very generic phrase, smokeless powder, things like that, different types of chemicals. So what we specifically did was, again, try to identify the HS codes that relate to those goods, because that's how we would analyse the movement of those goods from country A to country B, and then specifically look at which countries were importing those goods from the US in 2022 compared to 2021, and then see whether those same countries were then exporting those goods to Russia. So again, a clear trend with what we found with the Tier 1 to Tier 4B.
Yep.
Your countries in the CIS, your Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, I would say Armenia, Turkey, India to a degree as well, all reporting large increases of exports of those items listed in that executive order post-invasion compared to pre-invasion, and then again exporting those items to Russia more in 2022 and then even more in 2023 compared to before the invasion happened.
Thank you very much. And let's perhaps now talk about the supply chain finance and trade finance industry, because obviously coupled with that comes the financing of those goods to and from those countries. What role do banks and financial institutions actually play in preventing the financing of those goods, be that dual use goods or sanctioned goods that could actually end up in them breaking those sanctions regimes, and it ends up increasing goods exports to Russia? And what about the rest of the supply chain industry? So we have the insurers, the shippers, etc. How about we start with the banks and FIs?
Yeah, so there's obviously been a lot of focus on financial institutions from multiple kind of regulators around the world. Primarily, I would say the focus has been on financial institutions. So financial institutions would have to have a compliance procedure in place anyway, pre anything that happened to Russia. And then obviously post the first round of sanctions, they would have had to change their compliance program to ensure that they're now taking account of all of the Russian entities that have been sanctioned, all of the individuals that have been sanctioned, looking at the goods where previously they wouldn't have had to look at those types of goods, and then also looking at the movement of vessels of the goods that are being transported and the banks that are financing that specific transaction. So I'd say primarily the onus was on the financial institution to stop that, and they would have had to change their compliance procedures to kind of incorporate those changes. But my analysis would be that if they see anything that has Russia in it post sanctions, immediately you'd block it, or you'd want to review it instantly, and then you do your deeper dive into who is the entity, what are the goods, and then again specifically looking at the countries that we've just talked about that could be re-exporting. If there is a trade that is going from say the US to say Kazakhstan, for example, you now know that there is elevated risk based on the proximity of Kazakhstan to Russia, based on the data that we've just shown. Even though Kazakhstan is not a sanctioned country, why is that company now wanting to trade with Kazakhstan where previously they might not have? So does the trade make economic sense? So the onus would have been on the financial institution to do that. Moving on to the second part of your question, and what's come more into play in the last year, is specifically US government now saying it's not just up to the financial institution, it's up to everyone within the trade supply chain to ensure that they're remaining compliant. So towards the end of last year, there was it's called a quince seal notice, which was saying know your cargo, and it was saying the FI, the insurer, the freight forwarder, even the exporter, all have to essentially align and ensure that the goods that are being traded are in line with regulation. So looking at the entities, looking where the goods are going, what are the goods, does it make sense, ensuring everyone within the trade supply chain is compliant. And that's been kind of a constant rhetoric, I'd say, in the last year. So now I'd say it's not just the FI that's responsible, it's everybody, essentially.
And let's say you're an insurer, you're a producer, you're a shipper of those goods, you're a financier. How do you ensure that collaboration, and what are your key tips to really ensure that you are remaining compliant with some of those global sanctions?
Everyone would have to have some sort of compliance procedure in place to ensure that they're accounting for that. In an ideal world, there would be transparency between the bank and the shipper. That may or may not be happening right now. But the idea would be, if I'm a freight forwarder and I'm looking at a shipment, but I know that the bank has already blocked it because of a suspect party, me as a freight forwarder, I probably want to block it as well. So we're continuing to proceed. But I feel like there has to be some sort of standardization in terms of looking for those red flags, right? Looking for, where is the entity base? Where's the trade going? What is the good? Is it a sanctioned good? That should be your kind of core compliance check that everyone should be doing.
Thank you very much. And Ravi, final question. I think we're on the 14th round or something like that of Russian sanctions. What are the current projections from your perspective for the trading of these high priority items over the course of the rest of the year, especially with the anticipation of stricter sanctions?
Yeah, so you mentioned 14th round of sanctions. That's coming out very soon. The US government in the last few weeks have just released 500 new HSCOs, which are now controlled for Russian export or Russian trade. They've also targeted new entities that they've sanctioned in various countries, like Hong Kong, for example. As long as the conflict continues to happen, sanctions will continue to happen. And what will end up happening is they'll start targeting new sectors of the Russian economy. They've already kind of done agriculture to a degree, kind of sanctioning fertilizers, timber, all of that kind of stuff. They've already targeted transport, they've already targeted defense. They'll find new ways, new items to sanction Russia with until conflict essentially ends, is what my analysis would be of that.
LNG?
LNG, yeah, so that's a new one that's coming up in the 14th round. Again, as well as that in the 14th round, they're also looking at vessels that have entered Russian ports historically, and now saying that potentially they won't be allowed in the EU at all. So it will be more of that. And I just, like I said, I think it will continue to happen as long as the situation stays as it is.
Thank you very much, Ravi. And actually, on your white paper, are transshipment hubs facilitating the movement of Western-made components to Russia? You can download a lot more information, really see some of the graphs that we've been showing on the screen, and you can use the link that's available on this webinar to actually see those in more detail. Ravi, thank you very much for joining us on this live Tradecast. I know you've been also here to answer some questions, and please do send your questions through to us. Hashtag Trade Finance Global, hashtag Tradecast, and we'll get back to you with some answers. Ravi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.